Okay, so my best friend has two deaf parents, and when people normally think of deaf people, they kind of assume that because they can't hear, they can't do other like basic normal things like driving or talking or even working. And in August of 2011, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the unemployment rate for deaf people was 16.8%, while the national average for hearing people was, or rate for hearing people was 8.1%. So this rate is doubled for the deaf population, but if you were to look at a deaf person, like they look completely normal, and that's because they are. They can drive cars. And while many of them are completely mute, I can have regular talking, like speaking conversations with my friend's dad, who's actually able to talk. And while many deaf people are unemployed, they're still able to have normal jobs like the rest of us. So being deaf shouldn't really be considered a disability because deaf people can run their own businesses. The deaf community has its own culture and like community, and then the lives of deaf people are simply just a different way of living than ours. So although there are only a few deaf-owned businesses around the nation, the existence and success of these businesses prove that they can be just as successful as any other business. The Deaf Interpreter Services Incorporation reported that in their article from 2016 that in the U.S. there are about 600 deaf-owned businesses, but that grew to about 1,000 in 2016. And this shows that deaf-owned businesses are on the rise. So my friend's parents, Melody and Russ Stein, they actually own their own deaf-owned restaurant called Matsuria in San Francisco, and it opened in 2011, and it was California's first deaf-owned restaurant. And this pizzeria continues to prosper even in San Francisco's super competitive restaurant business. And Matsuria only hires deaf people, but you don't have to be deaf to eat here. I don't know like any sign language, and I eat here all the time. So basically, what you do is you just like point to whatever you want on the menu, and then if you wanted something extra taken out, like you just have to write it down, and like they can read and like they'll know what you're talking about. But now through new technology, you're able to order over the phone too. There's a system called a video relay service where, and as Timothy Regan in 2011 reported in the sign language study, stated that this service allows deaf people to communicate with voice phone users through video and internet. And so at Matsuria, if someone calls, there are like hidden lights set up throughout the ceiling and like in the kitchen that'll light up when there's an incoming call. So that notifies workers when like new calls are coming in. And so then once they like the customer is connected to the worker, an interpreter will relay messages back and forth to each party, and it's like basically instant. So yeah, they used to only get catch like 50% of their calls before this service, but now they catch like almost 95% of their calls. So people kind of make it seem like a deaf-owned business would be a lot more complicated than one run by hearing people, but it's honestly like not much different. Oh, sorry, there's like the process. I forgot to change it. Okay. So additionally, the deaf population has its own like culture and community. And deaf culture is a real thing. Like it has its own traditions such as films, folklore, literature, athletics, and poetry, as stated in Gallaudet's definition of American deaf culture. So the disabled label kind of pretty much comes from the barriers and limitations put into place by the hearing majority. But a culture is a culture, so why would a culture be considered a disability while Why would deaf culture be considered a disability when other cultures just considered minorities because of their differences? Because think about it, in Mankaya and Stevens' 2013 article from Hearing, Balance, and Communications, they pointed out that if a hearing person who didn't know any ASL was put into the deaf community, that hearing person would need accommodations to navigate the language barriers and cultural differences. So it's like if I were to go to a different country and immerse myself in their culture, I would need extra help to bridge the gap between my culture and the new one. So because deaf culture really is the same as any other culture, it should actually be considered a minority rather than a disability, just like all other minority cultures. And lastly, deaf people simply just live different ways of life, and this doesn't mean that they should be considered disabled. A comparison made by Johnson and Nito in their report in the Multicultural Perspectives in 2009 pointed out that the deaf community is visually oriented just like our community, the hearing community, is auditorially oriented. So where we have phones and the deaf community has the video relay service, and so we have doorbells that make sound, and instead the deaf community has doorbells with flashing lights, and we have, instead of loud alarm clocks, the deaf community has vibrating alarm clocks. And these are all just examples of life differences, and no way of living is better than the other. There are challenges and benefits to both ways of living, as stated by Alice Ann Darrow in her research article published in the Sage Journals in 2013. But because the majority of the world is hearing, a small group of deaf people unfortunately get labeled as disabled. So what can you do to help bridge the cultural gap between hearing and deaf worlds? There are 3 small things that you can do. The first is to treat deaf people like they're normal people, because they are. And the second is you can familiarize yourself with basic ASL greetings. So you know how we all know that gracias means thank you in Spanish? Well, you should also learn that this means thank you in ASL. And then the third is don't assume that deaf people can't do certain things, because they probably can. So for example, don't ask a deaf person if they can read, because I know my friend has gotten this question about her parents all the time, but common sense just tells you that what does being deaf have to do with your ability to read? So overall, being deaf doesn't really make a person less capable of doing things than a hearing person. Even though my friend is hearing, she had 2 deaf parents who raised her into a completely normal person. So I think the real difference here is not about disabilities, but more about the cultures that we all come from.
Okay. Was I supposed to bring the HDMI thing, or what am I? Oh, is it the VGA that plugs into this? Because I have the other one.
Yeah, the VGA plugs in.
Oh, technology works, man.
You have to switch it to VGA.
What do I do? What?
I think it's under there. It should be VGA.
Come on. Come on. I hit laptop. Hey, there it is. All right. It's a wonderful thing. Will you?
Are we okay on power?
Hold on. We're at a good. It doesn't say.
Okay?
Yeah, it's at 17.
Okay, we should be fine. So I'll plug in after Grace.
Where did the-
How long?